There was a recent TV ad that showed a young girl skipping a stone out across the water, a stone that eventually makes it halfway across the world into the canals of Venice. It's a good effect to show just how far one's actions can reach. At one time or another, I think we have all tried to skip flat stones across the serene waters of a pond nestled deep in the woods. But those stones really only skimmed the surface before disappearing into the water. To make a profound change, you have to drop a stone into the water and watch the ripples branch out in all directions. During this webcast, you will want to have a pen and paper handy because I'm going to give you a recipe. It's a very old set of cooking instructions and ingredients for stone soup. Ladies and gentlemen, the Stones. Paul Lowney said, "No one owns his life. Everyone, no matter how insignificant, has an effect on someone else, just as a stone sends out ripples when cast into still water. A person whose life doesn't touch another's is a person without a shadow." Which reminds me of this story from the great Native American Sioux Nation. My grandfather took me to the fish pond on the farm when I was about 7, and he told me to throw a stone into the water. He told me to watch the circles created by the stone. Then he asked me to think of myself as that stone person. You may create lots of splashes that will disturb the peace of all of your fellow creatures, he said. Remember that you are responsible for what you put in your circle, and that circle will also touch many other circles. You will need to live in a way that allows the good that comes from your circle to send the peace of that goodness to others. The splash that comes from anger or jealousy will send those feelings to other circles. You are responsible for both. That was the first time I realized each person creates the inner peace or discord that flows out into the world. We cannot create world peace if we are riddled with inner conflict, hatred, doubt, or anger. We radiate the feelings and thoughts that we hold inside, whether we speak them or not. Whatever is splashing around inside of us is spilling out into the world, creating beauty or discord with all other circles of life. This is something that was published in bits and pieces in Economics Press. It is called The Touchstone. When the great library of Alexandria burned, the story goes, one book was saved, but it was not a valuable book, and so a poor man who could read a little bought it for a few coppers. The book wasn't very interesting, but between its pages, there was something very interesting indeed. It was a thin strip of vellum on which was written the secret of the touchstone. The touchstone was a small pebble that could turn any common metal into pure gold. The writing explained that it was lying among thousands and thousands of other pebbles that looked exactly alike. But the secret was this: the real stone would feel warm while ordinary pebbles are cold. So the man sold his few belongings, bought some simple supplies, camped on the seashore, and began testing pebbles. He knew that if he picked up ordinary pebbles and threw them down again because they were cold, he might pick up the same pebble hundreds of times. So when he felt one that was cold, he threw it into the sea. He spent a whole day doing this, but none of them was the touchstone. Yet he went on and on this way. Pick up a pebble, cold, throw it into the sea. Pick up another, throw it into the sea. The days stretched into weeks, and the weeks into months. One day, however, about mid-afternoon, he picked up a pebble and it was worn. He threw it into the sea before he realized what he had done. He had formed such a strong habit of throwing each pebble into the sea that when the one he wanted came along, he still threw it away. So it is with opportunity. Unless we are vigilant, it's easy to fail to recognize an opportunity when it is in hand, and it's just as easy to throw it away. From the touchstone to the wise woman's stone. A wise woman who was traveling in the mountains found a precious stone in a stream. The next day, she met another traveler who was hungry, and the wise woman opened her bag to share her food. The hungry traveler saw the precious stone and asked the woman to give it to him. She did so without hesitation. The traveler left rejoicing in his good fortune. He knew the stone was worth enough to give him security for a lifetime. But a few days later, he came back to return the stone to the wise woman. "I've been thinking," he said. "I know how valuable this stone is, but I give it back in the hope that you can give me something even more precious. Give me what you have within you that enabled you to give me this stone." Sometimes it's not the wealth you have, but what's inside you that others need. And this from writer John Wayne Schlatter and published in a second helping of Chicken Soup for the Soul. It's an excerpt from a story called The Magic Pebbles, and I quote, "One night a group of nomads were preparing to retire for the evening when suddenly they were surrounded by a great light. They knew they were in the presence of a celestial being. With great anticipation, they awaited a heavenly message of great importance that they knew must be especially for them. Finally, the voice spoke. Gather as many pebbles as you can. Put them in your saddlebags. Travel a day's journey, and tomorrow night will find you glad, and it will find you sad." After having departed, the nomads shared their disappointment and anger with each other. They had expected the revelation of a great universal truth that would enable them to create wealth, health, and purpose for the world. But instead, they were given a menial task that made no sense to them at all. However, the memory of the brilliance of their visitor caused each one to pick up a few pebbles and deposit them in their saddlebags while voicing their displeasure. They traveled a day's journey, and that night, while making camp, they reached into their saddlebags and discovered every pebble they had gathered had become a diamond. They were glad they had diamonds. They were sad they had not gathered more pebbles. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stayed on the moon a total of 21 hours, 36 minutes, and 21 seconds. During their brief stay, they collected nearly 22 kilos of lunar rock and soil to bring back to Earth. Guy Marchi gives us something to think about when we see the moon rising in the east. He wrote, "What is the moon but a huge stone weighing 81 quintillion tons, moving daily over our heads at better than 1,000 miles an hour?" End quote. You know, he wrote an article called The Secret Life of Rocks that was featured in the 1987 edition of the Old Farmer's Almanac. He wrote, and I quote, "Most people regard rocks as dead. Yet with patience, one can notice signs of life in almost any stone. As a matter of fact, stones get around sufficiently for their needs, with and without assistance from humans and others, even if it may take the perspective of a geologist to notice it. After all, rocks do not eat 3 meals a day, nor even a nibble per millennium. They have patience beyond imagination. Eventually, however, they all have to move, mostly downhill. If you are a pebble in a brook, say, on a mountainside, you may find yourself just sitting there for 20 years or maybe 50, depending on how deep is the pool you're in. But sometime, some year, there will come a cloudburst with tumultuous rain. And the brook will suddenly turn into such a raging torrent that it will scoop you out of your pool, and you will tumble down the brook a few hundred yards until at last you get lodged in a deeper pool, where you will rest a few more centuries, or maybe a millennium or 3. It won't be difficult, for you will be sustained by your interminable patience. And so it goes. It might take 1,000,000 years for a pebble to make it all the way down a river like the Mississippi. Much would depend on its size and the flood frequency. Bigger pebbles and stones naturally take longer, but smaller ones, down to sand size, would move faster. Silt still faster, and clay almost dissolved into the molecular structure of the water, about as fast as the water itself. Any mineral grain as small as sand, of course, can also take to the air, as in a sandstorm, and migrate as swiftly as the wind to virtually anywhere on Earth. In fact, it hardly stretches reality at all for us to start thinking of rocks as growing, basking, shivering beings with a very real life of their own. The authorities on this subject are mineralogists who, with their modern instruments, have accumulated conclusive proof that some rocks literally do grow, that some ungrow, some glow, some radiate, some disintegrate, some, like asbestos, are hairy, and some even get ill, perhaps from poison, and later return to good health. You probably have seen 6 stones yourself, in the form of calcareous carvings on old city buildings, which are commonly crusted with sulfurous dust from smoke and exhaust fumes. 6 stones. Who would have thought? Now, the stone house on the lakefront is finished, and the workmen are beginning the fence. The palings are made of iron bars with steel points that can stab the life out of any man who falls on them. As a fence, it is a masterpiece, and will shut off the rabble and all the vagabonds and hungry men and all wandering children looking for a place to play. Passing through the bars and over the steel points, will go nothing except death and the rain and tomorrow. That's called A Fence by Carl Sandburg. You know, that poem reminded me of this poem called Mending the Wall by Robert Frost. Frost wrote, "Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen groundswell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun and makes gaps even two can pass abreast. The work of hunters is another thing. I have come after them and made repair where they have left not one stone on a stone, but they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs. The gaps, I mean, no one has seen them made or heard them made, but it's spring mending time, we find them there. I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. We keep the wall between us as we go, to each the boulders that have fallen to each, and some are loaves, and some so nearly balls we have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. We wear our fingers rough with handling them. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game. One on a side, it comes to little more. There, where it is we do not need the wall, he is all pine, and I am apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines, I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbors. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But there are no cows. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. I could say elves to him, but it's not elves exactly, and I'd rather he said it for himself. I see him there bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand, like an old stone savage armed. He moves in darkness, as it seems to me, not of woods only, in the shade of trees. He will not go behind his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well, he says again, good fences make good neighbors. This is a story that shows how to make the ancient art of alchemy really work. It's called Stone Soup by Marcia Brown, and I quote, "Three soldiers trudged down a road in a strange country. They were on their way home from the wars. Besides being tired, they were hungry. In fact, they had eaten nothing for 2 days. 'How I would like a good dinner tonight,' said the first. 'And a bed to sleep in,' added the second. 'But that is impossible,' said the third. On they marched, until suddenly ahead of them they saw the lights of a village. 'Maybe we'll find a bite to eat and a bed to sleep in,' they thought. Now, the peasants of the place feared strangers. When they heard that 3 soldiers were coming down the road, they talked among themselves. 'Here come 3 soldiers,' they said. 'Soldiers are always hungry, but we have so little for ourselves,' and they hurried to hide their food. They hid the barley in the haylofts, carrots under quilts, and buckets of milk down the wells. They hid all they had to eat. Then they waited. The soldiers stopped at the first house. 'Good evening to you,' they said. 'Could you spare a bit of food for 3 hungry soldiers?' 'We have no food for ourselves,' the residents lied. 'It has been a poor harvest.' The soldiers went to the next house. 'Could you spare a bit of food?' they asked. 'And do you have a corner where we could sleep for the night?' 'Oh, no,' the man said. We gave all we could spare to the soldiers who came before you, and our beds are full, lied the woman. At each house, the response was the same. No one had food or a place for the soldiers to stay. The peasants had very good reasons, like feeding the sick and children. The villagers stood in the street and sighed. They looked as hungry as they could. The soldiers talked together. The first soldier called out, "Good people, we are 3 hungry soldiers in a strange land. We have asked you for food, and you have no food. Well, we have to make stone soup." The peasants stared. And the recipe for stone soup next. Three war-weary soldiers, hungry for food and looking for shelter for the night, have encountered the inhabitants of a village on their long trek home. They asked for a meal and lodging for the night, but to a man and woman, all the villagers found some reason for refusing both. So the soldiers have declared to the townspeople that if no food can be found, then they must prepare stone soup for themselves. And here's their recipe. You may want a pen and paper to copy it down. And I quote, "The soldiers asked for a big iron pot, water to fill it, and a fire to heat it. And now, if you please, 3 round, smooth stones." The soldiers dropped the stones into the pot. "Any soup needs salt and pepper," the first soldier said. So children ran to fetch salt and pepper. "Stones make good soup, but carrots would make it so much better," the second soldier added. One woman said, "Why, I think I have a carrot or 2. She ran to get the carrots. "A good stone soup should have some cabbage, but no use asking for what we don't have," said the third soldier. Another woman said, "I think I can probably find some cabbage," and off she scurried. "If only we had a bit of beef and some potatoes, this soup would be fit for a rich man's table." The peasants thought it over, then ran to fetch what they had hidden in their cellars. A rich man's soup, and all from a few stones. It seemed like magic. The soldiers said, "If only we had a bit of barley and some milk, this soup would be fit for a king." So the peasants managed to retrieve some barley and some milk. "The soup is ready," said the cooks, "and all will taste it, but first we need to set the tables." Tables and torches were set up in the square, and all sat down to eat. Some of the peasants said such a great soup would be better with bread and cider, so they brought forth the last 2 items, and the banquet was enjoyed by all. Never had there been such a feast. Never had the peasants tasted such delicious soup, and all made from stones. They ate and drank and danced well into the night. The soldiers asked again if there was a loft where they might sleep for the night. "Oh no," said the town folk. "You wise men must have the best beds in the village." So one soldier spent the night in the priest's house, one in the baker's house, and one in the mayor's house. In the morning, the villagers gathered to say goodbye. "Many thanks to you," the people said, "for we shall never go hungry now that you have taught us how to make soup from stones." End quote. Maybe not gold from base metals, but who would have imagined soup from a stone? Good night, sweet dreams. I'm Don Jackson. Oh, by the way, soup's on.